Hello and welcome to another Patreon tutorial video. In this month's video, we're covering part 2 of the environments and settings tutorial that we began last month. So in last month's video, the main focus was talking about how to set up the painting, how to prepare to begin the painting, right? For example, we've talked about the magic of immersion, right? What it does for you and how it can be really useful. We've also began talking about how to create said immersion, right? Mainly about the planning stages and explaining why you need to do them. For example, I've talked about why you need to be very specific when you're looking out for ideas, or rather or perhaps when you have an idea, how specific you need to be when you actually sort of dictate the direction in which the piece will go. So having a specific plan, and then of course, once you have that specificity, you can make use of it to research and gather the right references that you know you will need, right? And you want to make sure that your initial ideas are sort of substantiated by the reference. For example, if you're imagining this sort of setting, is it viable? Does it look at least somewhat similar to what you have in your head and all that kind of stuff? And then we also talked about sketching and on-canvas planning, right? Essentially the sort of sketch, very rough stage, where we pay attention to some of the very important keystones of the piece and make sure we get those things in as early as possible, and so that we can also assess and see if we should change anything up before actually painting. So in this video, we'll mainly be talking about sort of the part 4 of these 4 steps, right? Lighting, harmony, and color, plus detailing, plus a little bit more, because this is the full painting sort of process that I want to go through in a systematic way and break down the process for you. So without further ado, let's sort of head into the painting itself. Right here, so here's the references that we have used last month and we'll be continuing to use. And here is the painting process that we'll be going through today. So I'll be talking about these stages, right, going through from 1 to stage 3C, which is the final piece, and then we'll be covering how we are going to proceed from each step to the next, what things are we doing from each step to the next, and then talking about these 5 sort of main criteria that we're looking at every time sort of we assess our own drawing and think about how we need to change it, how we need to improve it, and so on and so forth. Let us begin. So in stage 1 is where we left off last month. We managed to capture some of the basic features of what we want in our particular scene. So for example, we've consulted a bunch of references based on our imagination, and then we've thought about it and it was like, okay, so we're going to use this type of structure and this sort of angle, which I think makes a really interesting sort of scenery, a really interesting picture. So we want to use this for our basic sort of composition. So this is exactly what we did for part 1. We've sketched out some of the basic features, as well as also improvised and designed some of our own, because we're not exactly trying to recreate this specific like actual place, right? So we're borrowing some of the structures, which adds to the composition. So I think that's really important to highlight as well. Right, so once we've done that, right, the next step is naturally to start filling the values and start thinking about how we want to set up the lighting and all sorts of this sort of basic things. So one of the things that I really like to do straight after the sketch stage is to think about what sort of lighting options or what kind of big directions that I can go in. So if we look at these stage 1A and stage 1B, this is sort of the process by which I start to explore a couple of options that branch off very far from each other, right? Because of course, like if we only have one main direction, we can branch off a little bit here, a little bit there. But if we want to branch off a lot, right, like drastically different looking pieces, we should try and do it early so we don't, waste a lot of time before realizing that perhaps we should explore another option. So now it's time for me to sort of bring in these 5 very colorful words: design, volume, depth, color, and lighting. So I think a good way to assess ourselves at each stage of the process as we paint, as we sort of think about, whether the thing we are creating as of now is immersive, is interesting. I think these are 5 good criteria to judge the situation by. So as we begin, remember that I said to use a lot of references. So the top option of the blue setting is inspired by this particular sort of image here. So I thought it was a pretty striking color scheme, right? It's really high contrast. It has like a good way to, it has a good range of values. So it's not just like, okay, completely dark or completely bright, right? So it's like an interesting contrast of values, but it's also feasibly realistic, right? Because we have all this kind of like really dark volcanic rock with like this white foamy water. So I thought that was an interesting combination, and this was this was my sort of attempt at seeing how that will work out. So I think for this particular setting, I think it will work fine, right? But it creates more of like a surreal feeling that is a bit harder to relate to in a way, I think, right? Or rather, it's harder to fully execute it as well. So I decided to explore another option, which was to have a more standard sort of evening dusk type of lighting, but with some light sources to add to this sort of interest factor of the piece. So it's almost a formula that I use quite consistently, but there's so many ways to play with it. There's so many ways to, synergize it with different settings. I think it's really a worthwhile sort of almost a template, right, to come back to and think about at least using. So this is sort of like stage 1A, where I explore the basic option. And then stage 1B is where we advance a bit more and then explore the option a bit more, right? Because if it passes, for example, this initial stage, I want to see if I develop it a bit more, does it work out? Does it not work out? And which one do I prefer? So let's, talk about the colorful words that I was about to, talk about. So in terms of design, I think when we design something, right, it's more the case of our intention, I would say, right? Because the rest of them, there's a lot of execution involved. But when we're talking about design, I would say it's mainly in this particular definition of mine, in this context, it's talking about sort of our intentions for the piece. So for this top sketch here, right, in terms of design, I thought it was interesting, but it was a bit hard to understand it as it is, right? Because we have these sort of very mixed sort of ruins, right, as compared to a really clean, almost surrealistic white landscape here. I thought it doesn't fit quite as well, right, because of the more complicated shapes and more complicated features that don't do quite as well or don't fit quite as well with this particular color scheme, right? So in terms of design, I felt like a more like a magical forest type of design, a more classic fantasy kind of design feel is more suitable. So this is sort of what my decision making is made of on this stage. So if we briefly go over volume, right, in this particular situation, right, notice as we transition from a sketch to both these drawings, we want to make sure that we're showing volume, right? What do I mean by volume? A lot of things that appear on the screen, right, or appear on a canvas, you have to sort of convince people that they are physical objects. And the best way to convince people of that is, of course, to create this illusion that they are, for example, drawing in the shadows, right, making sure they have surfaces, right? They have individual surfaces. All surfaces are accounted for. For example, if we look at this particular like protrusion from below, right, we must be able to see like a bottom surface of it over here. Let me just sort of highlight it to make it a bit more clear, right? So we're able to see this bottom surface here, and of course we see this like major surface here. So this is what I'm talking about when we talk about volume, right? We have to pay attention to that, not just sort of muddle our way through that. And of course, especially when you're drawing more complicated structures, right, reference on our left here is always very helpful. And in terms of depth, I feel like it's almost part of volume, but depth is something that is sometimes a bit more subjective. So for example, volume, right? Let's say we have a bunch of things in a scene. There's no real way to avoid giving them volume, because in order to convince people they're kind of real, you have to do it. But with depth, it's somewhat up for design. So of course there exists scenes or compositions, or rather for even photos or real life locations that are, right, not the best for a photograph, or not a best place to depict in terms of like how scenic or pretty it is. And sometimes it's because, right, the photo or something doesn't have enough depth. So when we are drawing, right, we have the option of increasing this particular depth. So for example, we can add additional items in the foreground, layer things above each other based on our line of sight, and then create this sort of cascading effect as right the scene sort of moves on further and further away from us. So that's sort of what I mean when we say depth is really flexible. You can design how much the scene moves, or whether you want a scene to be more flat because you're capturing like this one specific thing, or is it a style of presentation you like, right? Depth is one thing that we also think about as well quite early on. Right, another thing about volume is that you don't get to choose, right? For example, no matter how you layer the depth, you're still going to be having to account for the volume of all of them eventually, right? And color is something I've actually accidentally already talked about, right? For example, the color schemes sort of also relate into the design in this situation. And not only that, right? The color I felt like for the second option below here is a bit better than the top option. Because it's much easier, I felt like in the second option to feel a range of warm or cold colors. For our first option, you could say that the black in this sort of warmish blue is accounts for warm colors, but I feel like the range is a bit low for in general, and so that's not quite what I intended in this situation. So for the color, this is also why we also decided to go for this. And then for lighting, I also thought the bottom one was a bit more interesting because we have more varied sources of lighting. For example, the weak light or like a dusk or evening situation, or rather time of day, plus like a stronger light, and that includes color. And so that sort of is a more interesting color combination to me than just a straight up, like a top down, midday but kind of cloudy situation that we have up here as well. So this is the 5 criteria that we will use for the rest of the process as well. So, but this is a quick example of how I go through like 2 different directions and then make my decision based on these 5 criteria. And of course, right, I can be a bit loose sometimes. Not always do I like strictly bring up this list and then look back and forth from each of them. With practice and with some flexibility, right, you can always sort of internalize the this process and then make decisions from there on forth. And of course, during this entire process, consult references, not just like the main one, but also consult others, right? Some of them they are not quite on this list because sometimes you have to be impromptu, just search them up, right? Like for example, the rocks here is like one of the examples. What kind of shapes you want to use to sort of recreate the feeling that okay, the viewer's looking at rocks, right? You want something to be more artificial, like this like long piece of stone here that could possibly be a pillar or another part of the construct, versus smaller pieces of stone that's like more organic in shape. Right, so now let's move on to stage 2. Stage 2 is where we stage 2 is mainly after we pick our main option, right? So we've picked or decided on doing this particular, or rather going with this particular option, and so in stage 2 we're continuing from that. So what happens here is that we're going to try and roughly, right, and roughly is the keyword here, sort of help ourselves visualize what the final piece might look like. And in this situation, although normally we find that it may not be like a too good idea to add on permanent like special effects and all that really early on because you're not sure of some other things yet. This stage, right, stage 2, I feel like is a good way to sort of also throw in some of the effects that you think you will want towards the end. And what this does is to help give us an idea of like the sort of potential of the piece and where it can go. And as we paint, we can remove the this sort of these temporary rough visualizations, to paint a bit clearer, keep things a bit cleaner. But this is the intention, right? And the same concept again continues to apply, right? As I added this sort of area where there's a lot of floating lines and like gathering mist. To me, that felt like a good way to add depth because right, it adds another layer behind the character. Right, the character is sort of not quite under the archway, but walking on like the pathway on top of this platform, right? But is in front of this archway. So this is all the situation and the depth I want to create, and this fog actually helps me create it quite well because I don't want the illusion that, right, for example, the character is actually walking like right under the archway. running to a wall. So that's sort of the situation that adding or visualizing these small things can help a lot with. And also it just adds a bunch of interesting stuff to this area and a bit of noise to this area as well. As for color and lighting, it justifies a bit more as to why the top part is brightly lit, as well as sort of adds a bit more complexity to the situation here as well, which is very nice because we want to make this particular chosen color pop out as much as possible. And so this is sort of the stage 2 of the process. Not much has changed, but we're just visualizing what is like the next best option for us to go to. So now let's move on to stage 3. So stage 3, as you can see, is significantly different from excuse me, right? I actually went in the wrong order. I was wondering why I skipped forward so much. So actually, stage 2 comes right down here to stage 2A. So what happens next after we have this sort of good visualization, we are good to go. What happens next is that what I like to do is to start cleaning up the main character. I think it's a good place to start from, right? Especially if you're drawing a scene where there is a human character or animal character or just a center of focus, right? And usually that comes in the form of a character. So the next step is usually to clean that up and figure out how like the basics of the character or the center of interest works. And that also involves cleaning up certain things surrounding the character. For example, the forest in the background, right? We transition a bit more from this mess with a lot of sketch lines to something cleaner as well. Also in this process, we remove a lot of sketch lines that are clearly in the way, because sometimes there's a bit of a gray zone, right? Because sometimes when you sketch and you're very messy, the sketch in some areas, especially in this sort of organic setting, adds a bit of life to the situation, because from afar and when using your imagination, right, these sketch lines can represent a bunch of stuff. So if we clean them up a little too quickly, right, it might depopulate the scene of details a bit too soon. So this part is a little bit harder than usual because, right, we have to pick and choose which lines to remove and which lines to actually transition them into like actual details. Right, so this is sort of the process where I try to do that while cleaning up some of the main areas as well, where I know that, okay, so this is like a man-made structure. It's going to be sort of have this clean look. It's not going to have like random lines that justify like small rocks here and there at the moment. So this is sort of the process, right, that we go to right after we have a basic understanding of where the piece might end up. So again, if we consult our design, volume, depth, color, and lighting list, we look at this situation and it's like, okay, so we're going to try and enhance all of them, right? We're trying really hard not to go backwards from the sketch, which is what I just mentioned about the sketch lines. So we want to make sure in terms of design, we preserve the density and interesting parts of the design as we slowly clean up the sketch lines. In terms of volume as well, right? The sketch lines, even though they're super rough, initially they represent certain things, and those certain things could be objects in the scene that add depth, objects in the scene, or rather those lines could represent important parts of the volume of different big objects or small objects in the scene as well. So we want to preserve those. So in stage 2A, we're thinking about preserving a lot of this as we sort of remove the very rough sketch lines that obviously, they're not going to make it to the final painting. In terms of color and lighting here, there's not much to talk about, other than I'll say that sometimes the lines represent shadows, so be careful about that as well as you sort of clean up the lines, because if you remove everything at once, right, you'll suddenly notice that, okay, wait, some of them are actually needed to indicate surfaces or indicate shadow. Right, so lighting is also a bit of a concern as we clean things up. Color, not so much here at the moment. So moving on to stage 2B. So this is where we sort of take out the rest of the rough lines and start painting in things as they are. This is, I think, the stage that sort of looks the worst, because we remove a lot of the the rough lines, right? Because eventually you have to kind of remove them, but then you haven't quite filled in the actual detail yet. So we remove the placeholder, but I haven't put in the actual thing yet. And this is also where we start thinking about more things in more detail, like lighting direction on our smaller surfaces and volumes, basically going to higher fidelity, right? So from here to here, we are cleaning things up, and then from here to here, we are fully sort of cleaning things up and then adding a bit more detail to the areas that are especially in focus and need them because they will be in scrutiny as well. And then there's not too much to talk about in this stage other than just sort of holding out and keep and kind of like believing in the process in a way, because it's not going to look quite as good for a while. So you notice here also that for these two stages, I removed the sort of lighting or the fog lighting effect, because at the moment I was like, okay, so I know I want that back, but for the moment I want to get rid of it so I can like focus on drawing the character and focus on drawing the immediate background, right? So we don't want that to get in the way. So stage 2C is where I think I started to re-add these special effects back in. Because right as we start clearing the rest of the scene up, we're ready to start reintroducing the more complicated, or like last mile, in a sense, last mile elements back into the scene as well. And also we noticed that we added some things like these hanging vines, both in the foreground and the background. Right, again, this is part of our depth checklist. We want to make sure that, okay, so we have foliage on both sides of this archway. What is the best way to show it? Okay, in this case, one piece of foliage in front, one, segment of archway, and then another piece of foliage behind, and then we have the trees. So this is like the depth that we're describing quite literally here, right? Exactly with this setup. With volume as well, as we draw the leaves, we want to make sure to not just draw like one flat piece, like a 2D, like cardboard cutout of a bunch of foliage. And the best way to do this is shadows, right? Because we have like a weak dusk lighting, where we have the light source coming in from above. So some simple stuff, but I think it's still worth mentioning as always, right? With the lighting coming in from above, so we are able to see some of the leaves that are lit up by the moonlight and some that are darker. And because we are looking up from things, from the situation from below, right, essentially, and a lot of leaves really face upwards, right? Because the plant wants to photosynthesize, it's going to grow its leaves facing upwards. So we're going to mainly be seeing shadows. So we're going to when we look up, right, at like a bunch of foliage, we're mostly going to see shadows with like small slivers of areas where you can see the leaves sort of more exposed to the light itself. So this is part of the volume of our checklist as well. All right, in terms of design, we're maintaining what we've been doing. So there isn't too much to talk about in this stage. In terms of color and lighting, we're bringing back the more complicated aspects of like these little lights, like a colored sort of mist because of the light. Yeah, and so this is what we are maintaining it, right? And then improving on the volume, the depth, as we add different things to the piece as well. So moving on to stage 3. So stage 3 is where things really start to take shape. I think is something that I was just talking about, right? We need to hold out for a bit longer as we clean things up, because later on, once we have like a good sort of clean setup, we can re-add back in a lot of the details. So remember all these nonsense sketch lines here that contributed as good placeholders, but are obviously completely unacceptable for the final piece. Yeah, we're going to try and add that effect that they convey back in. And this is how we do it in stage 3. So in stage 3 here, we are mainly concerned with re-adding detail, right? So what I've done here is to borrow some waterfall textures and then lay it on here. So again, right, I'm not just pasting the image directly, I'm using a bit of trickery here. So I set, for example, a waterfall, set it to the lighten layer. And what that set it to a lighten layer? So you can see here on the right here, there's a lighten type of layer type. Or rather, what did I say? There's a lighten layer type. So what that does is it causes the image with that layer to only express parts of it that is brighter than everything else below it. So usually in waterfall, you have like these bright white foam streaks that are going to stand out. So that is the how I laid on the this high detail like foam sort of waterfall effect. And then at the same time, right, we also added some foliage growing in between the rocks. As you can see here, right, these rocks are way too empty, so they look kind of unnatural. But with foliage, and then again, that is part of the design element, right? This is where we have to do a bit of designing again, because initially we may not have thought of this exact setup for our painting when we are drawing these rough sketch lines. But at this point in time, I was like, okay, so rethinking the design, it is clearly in like a forested area because of the sort of vines and leaves on the archway plus the background. It makes perfect sense for there to be some sort of nature overriding these like fallen pillars and stuff in the foreground as well. So there's a mixture of foliage, live foliage, creating their own shadows and volume. Again, remembering depth and volume, we're layering these as well, right? For example, this piece of foliage here is strictly in front of the rock, while this sort of foliage kind of like starts going behind, right? So this is sort of the interesting thing that I want to create. And again, the foliage helps us add a second, another layer between this sort of big platform and these rocks in the background, because now there's like this extra foliage layer here. So again, this is adding more depth. Same with this area, right? Now we have this thing coming in between this big platform and like the background area here. Same with this foliage, this piece of foliage as well. So this is how we are basically constantly designing, checking the volume and depth. And in terms of color and lighting, we're also making sure that they convey the basic scheme. There's nothing too insane going on here, but one interesting thing here I think I did okay and made a good decision on was having like this sort of brownish grass. I think this was quite interesting because the grass, I think I had a bit of a hard time differentiating it from like the background, right? So in order to make the layering really come out, I decided to say, okay, why don't we use like dry grass instead? And I think that worked out quite well because it creates like two different types of foliage, which adds to, again, the design as well as the depth, because we can visually separate them a bit clearer. And of course, in other areas, we've also sort of cleaned out, right, from transition from this super rough pillar to this like more beveled edge. Right, so this is also part of design because, right, when we have like a more ornate structure or more complicated structure like this, sometimes you have to think about stuff like, okay, instead of like just like a one block piece of sharp edge, right, is it like more of a bevel? Doesn't it make more sense? And all sorts of stuff like that. And a lot of things also adding more bevel to different pieces of debris, right? So this is a good way of adding detail when it's possible, right? Because rarely do things in nature exist, or rarely things in reality exist really simply as like boxes. It's a simple like cuboids, right? Oftentimes there are lots of uneven edges, there's lots of beveling going on. So we're introducing all that in this stage. And oh yeah, one last thing to mention design-wise is also these blocks. I thought it was interesting because I was looking up some pictures of man-made waterfalls and stuff like that. I realized, okay, that could be an interesting feature to have like the waves break on these little sort of protrudings. And they also add a nice amount of detail to the scene as well. They also add this like confirmation, right, that this giant like platform here is man-made as well, because previously you can't quite tell, right, like is it like just normal rock? But then if it's normal rock, why is it flat? So it puts things in like an awkward zone that, you know, when we are drawing stuff, we really don't want to go into the awkward zone, right? It's one thing to decide that this is like, okay, natural rock, then we add like textures and the streaks. Like I think the reference here as an example, where is it? I think it's not quite here at the moment. Oh, right. I think it's here, right? I thought about it. So I saw this area underneath the statues, and I was like, okay, so this could be the effect that I want. right? I want the area under like the big platforms to basically be these like jagged layered stones. But then it didn't feel quite right because it was adding on a bit too much detail, and it was taking away from the archway because it's kind of weird that this giant archway is just built on like jagged rocks, right? So I decided, okay, so let's go all in and make it really clear design-wise that we are going for artificial structure. Right, so that's it for stage 3. Now, as we start going to the final parts of the drawing, I was thinking about a couple of different things. So firstly, I felt like, okay, the scene was fine, but in terms of lighting, things were a bit too dull, right? There wasn't quite enough contrast at any point of the drawing other than like the lantern, which was fine, but I wanted to try things a bit more. So the first thing I did was to separate out the color temperature a bit more. So falls quite squarely under our color, right? To make sure that it gives a more of a moonlight look to the scene. So the scene is now kind of like evenly lit by moonlight, with this bluish tint, especially compared to our sort of yellowish area under the archway. What also kind of carries along from before is that we maintain our consistency, right? For example, the yellow grass now sort of just looks like a neutral color, right? It's not a saturated yellow anymore, it's just like a gray. And the gray, in contrast with this blue, is going to have a bit more of a yellow tint. So this is sort of like harmonizing the colors, which is sort of the process as well. So that's sort of one of the things that we check as we proceed to the next stage. So in this stage, things are mostly about color. So we're going to talk about color and lighting here. It also spills over a bit to design, right? Because we decide, right, that this is going to be clearly like a natural sort of dusk where the moonlight is coming down and it's having like this very stereotypical bluish tint. And then we move on to stage 3B, where more changes are going to happen as well. So we take one step further and start adding in even more detail, right? For example, the cracks to these rocks, adding these lights in the foreground as well, which add little points of lighting in the scene. Again, remember, this is what we initially began with, right? This is our initial idea. So if we check back with our initial idea, now we're sort of coming full circle, right? We've touched on every single problem, solve them. And then in the cleaning process, we temporarily remove those small little lights, and then now we are back. Because again, that is part of our design and that is what we want. So we have to sort of maintain it. And this is the natural progression of things as well. And these lights actually do a bit more than just being like fun design. They also add a good amount of volume and depth as well, because the size of these like little lights, they're going to tell us sort of the distance they are from the camera or our point of view. And that is really good for depth because our brain kind of imagines, or rather assumes, that these little pinpricks of light are about the same size. So if we support this sort of assumption by having the big ones being like the clear foreground, right? For example, the big ones being in front of these rocks, right? That's going to help us create and cement the depth that we want. So this is also part of the process, right? Again, looking back at the big 5 points. Same with the sort of foliage. We also layer them on a bit thicker. So minor edits here and there. But there's one thing that I think is a big change from stage 3A to 3B. And it's one thing that I think is quite subtle, but I think is also quite effective as well. So in this particular stage, I decided to have like a more, rather a stronger moonlight effect in this area from the left, from the right and heading to the left. So this is compared to before, where the moonlight is kind of even, which is reasonable, but in terms of composition and design, right, and making the things interesting, it wasn't too good a lighting setup, right? Because it kind of made the scene feel a bit more miniature, you know what I mean? Because when the lighting is really even across the entire scene, it gives sort of this illusion that you're looking at something in miniature. Because generally, right, in real life, because of clouds, just and because of simple distances and how clouds block light and how like uh, large buildings, large objects obscure light, right? Things sort of really differentiate in lighting across especially big distances. So since you're drawing an actual big distance, right, and like it's a pretty big scene, we want to make sure that there's variation in lighting as well. So I thought, okay, so let's try making the lighting the right corner a bit brighter than, say, for example, the left corner and the bottom corner. That's going to give us the idea that, okay, so maybe the moon is on this side, right, and it's shining down, and then there's like a bunch of foliage in the way that's like blocking out this part of the drawing, right, from receiving the direct moonlight. So this is the concept, or rather the idea behind it, and that is sort of the design decision, right? In terms of volume and depth, again, it doesn't add it in a sense, but it enhances it a bit more. Because now we can clearly tell that this like flat surface, that is like this bunch of water and small rocks, are completely separate from like this side-facing surface, this bottom-facing surface. So this is really good for volume differentiation. And again, the only way, right, we can differentiate volume, I think I've said this before in previous tutorials, and the only way we can really differentiate the volume is to have different lighting, right? Because if lighting is completely the same across every single surface, all we see is like an oddly shaped 2D silhouette, which doesn't make sense at all, right? So lighting really helps us create volume, and this is kind of like a synergy that happens. So we're making use of lighting to enhance volume and depth as well, because it's going to create a clearer separation as opposed to a really like a low contrast one, which again is helpful, but sometimes we need the extra pop, which is why I think it's nice that I make the call to sort of add in a stronger white light here. At the same time, we still maintain the yellow light of the character and the warmth of this area, which I think is also interesting and important to maintain this kind of warm and cold contrast. Yeah, so this is sort of the process from here to here. In terms of painting, I would say the tools used, actually I haven't talked too much about the tools being used, right? So the tools used are really quite simple. Generally, all I use is like the simple round brush, which does this, right? Which is the same brush which I've been annotating with. It just does this. If you add pressure, it becomes more solid. If you make it light, it does sort of this. So there's nothing too fancy, but I will upload the foliage brush that I used, that I really use a lot for these plants. Because quite a few of you have been asking. Again, disclaimer, right? The foliage brush is not mine. It's just one of those that appears in so many different brush packs that I just have made a habit of using it because it just works perfectly fine. And yeah, so moving on to the final stage and the final piece. For this step, I added a bit of glow to it with soft light to sort of make it even stronger right, to kind of give it a mystical sort of radiant looking light, make the moonlight make a bit more magical looking. In hindsight, I think I shouldn't have made it so strong on the character because it competes a bit too much with the warm yellow light. So again, sometimes I also do forget about my own advice, right? So yeah, so this is the final piece, and this is where we began. So to do a quick recap of today's process and what we've explained, basically as we proceed from stage to stage, we check ourselves against these main 5 sort of, it's almost like a rubric, right? You check yourself against this main rubric, and this is really to help you when sometimes you feel like, okay, I'm at this stage, I don't know how to advance the drawing, what should I do? Am I not doing right? A good way to go about it is to check design. Okay, so in terms of design, are you happy with it? Okay, I'm happy with the design, but I want to make things clearer, right? So I want to maintain the same look, I want to maintain the same ideas, but I want to make things clearer. So this gives us an immediate objective to sort of proceed to the next stage. With volume and depth, they are for helping you check if the scene looks right. So for example, you're drawing a scene from like below and you're thinking, okay, this looks really weird, I'm not getting the feel of the perspective at all, and this might be a good time to check whether your volume and depth are in place, and then work on those. In terms of color and lighting, they're also a good way to start thinking about your piece in terms of how to make the design pop, right? because sometimes it's quite important to incorporate lighting and color into the design of a scene. Because you're designing a night scene, you have to pay attention to the lighting and color of the night, and so on and so forth. And then you can make these calls as you go along to the next stage and as you go along to the stage after that. So along this whole process, the idea is to pay attention to these 5 main elements, and then you want to constantly be thinking about them as much as possible. Again, right? This is just a I think this is a useful guide, right? Sometimes I always say, you know, this is just a guide, you know, don't listen to it too much. But I really think this particular set of 5 items is a really helpful guide, and I think it's really gonna be almost universal. When you want to draw something, you're having difficulties figuring out how to sketch something in, what your idea is missing. I think these are really big 5 important points when it comes to environment design, because this is what helps to bring out the environment the most, right? And that is really like something that I have to put focus on when it comes to drawing and creating an immersive environment. You really need to have all 5 of these things. So now to wrap up, I just want to say that sometimes we do still fall short, right? Even though we follow the 5 points. For example, it could be that, okay, actually once I finish the whole thing, I realize, okay, in terms of design, this thing could be improved, right? In terms of for example, designing this scene, I was thinking, okay, what if we had a different camera angle? What if we had a more dynamic angle, so we didn't have too many flat horizontal lines? That could have been great, right? Because there's now a lot of verticals and there are a lot of horizontals. It adds a bit of awkwardness to the scene. So there's one thing that I felt like could be done better in hindsight, right? So again, there's a disclaimer, even sometimes that you try your best to follow these 5, you're not going to be able to like suddenly create the perfect drawing immediately. But I really do believe that if we keep working on our fundamentals, if we keep being thoughtful and specific as we draw and we think about some of these key points, we're going to be able to improve piece after piece. Yeah, so this is the main thing that I want to talk about this particular tutorial, and I really hope that this kind of more thorough rundown is helpful as well. Again, right, I'm aware that I really didn't show too much physical painting because I feel like that's a bit of like a waste of sort of screen time in a sense, because they are just really mundane things that I'd rather tell you why and how these things are being done rather than just showing them being done, which is, you know, like I feel really is a bit too simple. So yeah, this is it for this tutorial. This is it for the tutorial on environment design and creating immersion. Hopefully you have found this tutorial helpful as a whole, and as always, part 1 is available on the Patreon as well, so please do check that out if you haven't seen that yet. And yeah, thank you so much for your support, and I hope to see you next month.